I heard last night was excellent. I heard you had a good time. I was told that we lost some good men yesterday. I know that the first keynote lost his voice, but something is still left there. So please, take a seat, let's get started. Time flies, so we only have 3 keynotes left for this year's CyCon. First keynote will be Mr. Jan Neutze from Microsoft. Microsoft has been a great supporter of CyCon throughout the years, so thank you. And Microsoft is also an active player in the discussion on international cyber norms. And Jan here this morning will share with us the latest developments in that regard. Jan, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I will do this one. Okay. This is on already? All right, excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming back in such strong numbers. I will immediately deny that having lost my voice has anything to do with last night's reception, although it was a great time. I'm very pleased to talk to you this morning. First of all, before I get into my talk, really want to sort of echo what Anna Maria said and pass back the thanks. I think CyCon has been an absolutely fantastic platform to really bring together folks from different backgrounds, legal, policy, technical, to discuss important issues about cyber conflict. We're very pleased to be a partner in that endeavor, and as you mentioned, from a company perspective, we've been involved in this dialogue about cybersecurity norms for a number of years. And so I'd like to talk to you about 3 things this morning. First, why we think cybersecurity norms are needed. I'll give you sort of an industry perspective on this. Secondly, we've done some thinking about how to actually bring together the various norms proposals that have been created and that have been considered over the last 2 to 3 years, really, and we'll outline what an organizing framework for those cybersecurity norms could look like. And then third, I'll talk about what we think some of the key challenges are, and I'll start getting into some of the solutions. So I think this is something that you're all very familiar with. We talk about the challenges around cybersecurity, cyber conflict, and the way we have sort of approached this over the years really relates to these 4 core categories in terms of cybersecurity threats. There's the cybercrime element. We're all very, very familiar with this, mostly perpetrated for financial purposes. And there's the espionage piece, and that really breaks down along a couple of different categories: economic espionage, military, and sort of the broader military political espionage. And then there's the cyber warfare domain, which really is something that I think we talk about a lot, but the discussion about it actually needs to be much more nuanced, because I would argue what we've seen to date has mostly been below the threshold. Actually, almost all of it has been below the threshold of what people generally refer to as warfare or international armed conflict. And we'll get into some of the complexities around this. But before I start talking about norms, let me talk just briefly about a couple of numbers and statistics that I find fascinating. And so we're all aware attacks are increasing, costs are rising, but it's fascinating when you look at some of these statistics here. Just cybercrime alone extracts about 15 to 20% of the value created by the internet. It's a huge number if you think about this. Some estimates, and there's different studies, of course, suggest that risks of cyber attacks can cost businesses globally up to $3 trillion. It's just a staggering number. And then one of the most interesting statistics, of course, every year we see in various reports, it's Mandiant, it's the Verizon data breach report, the number of days until breaches are discovered. And so there's some improvement there. In 2014, that number was 229 days between when an organization was breached and a breach was discovered. Last year, this was actually down by 24 days to 205 days. Still way too long, but we're seeing some improvements. And then, of course, just the sheer amount of customer records being stolen in these high-profile data breaches that we continue to hear about. 160 million records stolen just last year. And then, of course, I talked about the various threat categories. We're all aware that nation-state activity in cyberspace continues to ramp up. And so here's just an overview of some recent headlines. I'm not going to go through all of them. And while it's rare that we'll have conclusive proof of any one government performing any one action in cyberspace, I think it's indicative of the type of developments and the type of arms race that we're beginning to see. And one of the key challenges with this, and the thing that we're really extremely concerned about, is this aspect of unintended consequences and the non-discriminatory ways in which something that might start out as a very targeted action in cyber could actually lead to all sorts of other secondary and tertiary effects. Let me briefly recall what the 4 roles are that we think governments have in cyberspace. And I've talked about this before, but I want to recap it here. So from our perspective, it seems that governments have 4 roles in cyberspace. Governments are protectors of cyberspace. They pass regulation, and they're generally trying to protect the population, including in cyber. They're users of cyberspace, huge users, really a huge enterprise offering e-government services. Nowhere is that more apparent than here in Estonia. But they're also exploiters of cyberspace, and I think that has become quite apparent. And then finally, they have a law enforcement mission, really to monitor and collect data. And when you put this into context, it's just, from our perspective, we have this duality that is extremely interesting and yet challenging. On the one hand, you have 42 countries with defensive capabilities in cyber. 29 countries have, or are assumed to have, offensive capabilities. 16 of those countries with declared offensive capabilities. And then, excuse me, at the same time, you have close to 100 countries developing legislation and regulation. And oftentimes, it's the same countries that are investing in offense, in many ways exploiting broadly available ICT products and platforms, which are then turning around and are extremely concerned, legitimately concerned, about insecurity in cyberspace and trying to increase defenses through legislation and regulation. And so what we're seeing here is that we have these pressures coming from both sides. On the one hand, this rising international insecurity, and at the same time, this increasing regulatory pressure. And so, as I said, cyberspace is complex. And it seemed to us that what we really need to start developing is a simple framework for how to categorize and think through our responses. There's been a lot of calls for how to respond to all these attacks going on. Things like, we need to share more information. You'll hear that at every single cyber conference. Well, that's great. And it's true, we do need to share more information. And oftentimes, those information sharing partnerships tend to be limited, either by sector, and that can be good and bad, but they're also limited by national boundaries. It's very rare that you actually get a functioning, effective information sharing construct across national boundaries. Other people have said, well, the private sector should just start hacking back. Why don't you do that? And I think very clearly you run up against legal boundaries of what's societally acceptable. And so it seemed to us that we need to really think about who are the actors in this undertaking. It could be government, it could be private sector, it could be researchers. What are their objectives? What are they trying to accomplish? And are these objectives legally permissible and morally sound? What are the actions that underpin these objectives? And then finally, what are the impacts of both the actions and these objectives? And so what does all of this mean for industry? Let me just give you sort of a sense of why we are a big believer in the need to create normative frameworks and advance cybersecurity norms. It's very apparent to us that with every single attack, with every single successful exploit and massive data breach and the like, you do face a significant loss in trust, both in products, services, and those tend to not be isolated to one particular vendor or provider. Some are, but as major international banks have discovered when they were subject of targeted attacks, an attack on one major bank actually hurts the reputation and the trust of the global financial sector. And so they've started to very actively collaborate and share threat information. And we need other sectors to follow suit. And so loss of trust, I think, is probably the single biggest concern that we all have. But that's not the only thing. We're looking at very complicated response cycles. We don't have a building of engineers sitting around in Redmond or anywhere else just waiting for the next government APT to come in and then sort of scramble from an institutional perspective. We, of course, have a very sophisticated response team, but these attacks distort threat models. These attacks are costly both in terms of reputation, in human capacities that we need to invest, and of course, we do see this increased regulatory regime that is emerging, oftentimes with some very good intentions, but sometimes also with some unintended consequences, and we'll talk about that some more as well. So I think this is just sort of a list of some of the key concerns that we're looking at. And so let me just talk to you briefly about what we've been seeing emerge over the last 3 years, really. And it's been a fascinating time when you think about where we were 3 years ago and where we are today and how robust this international cybersecurity norms dialogue really has been. So over the last 3 years, you've had a total of, as we have, by our count at least, 8 cybersecurity norms proposals. 6 of them were really government-driven. 2 of them were really driven by non-government organizations, and I would count the Tallinn manual effort as the first of those. We published our norms proposal in late 2014, and I think what we're seeing here is sort of the collective body of work in this space, of course underpinned by many years before all of this. If you look at the GGE, for example, and the efforts at the UN since the late 90s, that has led to the discussion that we're in today. I'll do sort of a brief recap of what those 6 cybersecurity norms were that we proposed back in 2014. And they start, from our perspective, quite sensibly with the notion that states really shouldn't target private sector products, broadly available commercial off-the-shelf products, to insert vulnerabilities or take actions that otherwise undermine trust in products and services. And so I think this is something that we feel very strongly about. Second, we said that states need to have a clear vulnerability handling policy. What are the equity decisions that governments make when they think about, should we stockpile vulnerabilities or should we report them to vendors so they can fix them? And unfortunately, to date, we've seen very little progress in how governments actually think about, not in terms of how they think about it, but how they talk about and have declared these policies. There's a couple of governments, the United States included, that have actually publicly spoken about how they think about that equities process. And we'd like to see more of that. And then, of course, I won't go through all of these, but I think from our perspective, the notion that states should really be discriminate in their actions. They should not create what we call a mass event, which was our way of for example, thinking about the whole critical infrastructure aspect and protecting critical infrastructures in times of peace, is something that I think we've probably seen the most discussion in the last 2 years after this, or year and a half since we've published this paper. And so for comparison, if you look at some of the norms that the United Nations Government Group of Experts published in their report from last July, there's actually, I think we're beginning to see sort of a globally emerging consensus around some core aspects as they relate to not creating mass events, don't attack critical infrastructures in times of peace. Again, very broad. I think when we're getting to this, we need to drive really is another level of specificity. And it's also, the GG talked about not using certs for offensive actions. It talked about the connection between cybersecurity norms and human rights. So I think we're seeing progress in all of these debates. But as I've said, there were 8 proposals in total, and we have some consensus, for example, around the applicability of international law in cyberspace, but we really don't have a lot of consensus on how to operationalize much of this. And so as I said earlier, from our perspective, it seems that we need this organizing framework, and how we're thinking about it, both in terms of the actors, objectives, actions, and impacts, but also from a perspective of trying to make sense of these proposals, analyze them, and maybe group them in ways that would help us talk about them slightly more effectively. And so when we looked at all of these proposals, it seemed to us that there's a particular group of norms around offense and how to limit offense. The actors really are militaries and intelligence agencies. The objective is to reduce conflict. The action is to exercise self-restraint. And the impact is to mitigate unacceptable impacts of ICT. The second broad category really is around defense, defensive norms. And while the first two are and should be led by governments, I think the private sector needs to play a role on the defensive side as well when it comes to things like managing cyber risk or information sharing. Already talked about that. And then the third piece is about industry's role in this. And what we really think is there ought to be, this is one of the, I think, pieces of feedback we got from our paper. It's great that you, Microsoft, talk about what do you want governments to do, what do you want industry to do. And so we've put some thought into this, and you'll see some more detail on that forthcoming in a few weeks' time. But we're very actively thinking about what could a set of industry norms in this space look like. And very clearly, we believe that at least from sort of a global ICT infrastructure and platform perspective, that role should always be defensive. The mission should always be defensive. It should not be offense. I'm not saying that there aren't private sector actors who aren't quite active in offense. I'm sure there are. But from our perspective, if we look at who are the big platform companies, who are the ones that are in many ways serving large customer bases, you can't discriminate between whom you're going to patch in an event of a conflict and who you'll leave behind. And so we need to be defensively oriented, and we need to be impartial. And so just with maybe just a little bit more detail on kind of how we think about these three categories. Offensive norms. We've heard a lot about this category, especially at this conference. And in many ways, that's sort of what Tallinn Manual 1 was about. When you look at sort of the fact that international law applies in cyber, how it applies in cyber, and how we can ensure that we drive that global consensus around the applicability of international law. The challenge, however, is that much of the activity that occurs in cyber that we've seen over the last 2, 5, even 10 years is, as I mentioned, below the threshold of armed conflict. And so in addition to offensive norms, we are convinced that we need a strong set of defensive norms that really bring together governments and industry to manage that cyber risk, to protect critical infrastructures, to share information, to support victims of cyber attacks, and to really drive this joint engagement. And I think there's a lot of good work initially being done in this space, and you'll see more coming out. I think both from industry as well as the way that groups like the GGE and others think about this. And then, as I mentioned, from our perspective, the three core things that industry should bring to the table are the exchange of information, and there's a lot of threat intel in the industry. From our perspective, we collaborate even across competitive boundaries. We have a group set up at this point, I believe, 8 years ago, that includes other large companies, including Google, who we compete with quite actively. But on the threat intel side, we collaborate, we share information because we realize we both benefit from this. And not just between the two companies, but between a larger group of companies. Secondly, it's really about reducing attack surfaces, developing code securely so that you actually enhance the resilience of your products and services. And so really hardening these systems, absolutely critical. And then thirdly, it's really about coordinated vulnerability disclosure. And there's a very active debate actually happening here in Europe. The Dutch government is very actively pursuing this, and we're hopeful that the notion of enhancing and actually coming to a joint and broader understanding both in Europe and globally, around what a coordinated vulnerability disclosure approach should look like will evolve over the next few months. And so let me finish with sort of 3 core challenges that we see and that I think we need to collectively use the brain power in this room and other fora to try and solve. On the one hand, we need to ensure that we actually drive this norms consensus. Let's apply an organizing model that helps us really drive this discussion to a level where we can begin to drive this consensus in various fora. And again, it seems to us that the ones we've listed here, or the approaches we listed here, tend to be the ones that have been discussing these activities. I might point out, in addition to bilateral consultations on cyber that many, many countries have set up now, in addition to the GGE, the London process, in our paper a year and a half ago, we proposed something called the G20 plus ICT 20, which is really an attempt at bringing together the largest 20 economies on the planet with the largest 20 ICT organizations and platform companies, in addition to, should have actually been on the slide, in addition to the largest 20 NGOs, to really start driving a dialogue around cybersecurity norms that has sort of a manageable format, but is broadly representative, bringing together or representing citizens, customers, and NGOs around the world. And so I think trying to figure out not the one forum for where we discuss norms, but how to make progress across the board in these various approaches, extremely important. Second challenge, norms implementation. I think once we are driving toward agreement on what we want to achieve and what the objectives should be, we need to take action. And that action, some people talk about a global treaty for norms. Most people tend to think that's unrealistic. But let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. There are a number of ways at the regional level and the sub-regional level that can be extremely helpful here. Many countries, as I mentioned, are passing national regulation. So that's another way of actually driving some of this forward, including sort of declaratory policies from a nation-state perspective on things like vulnerability disclosure and coordination, but also on things like first-use policies, et cetera. And so I think there's various ways here too. We need to be creative in terms of actually thinking about how can we drive this forward and implement it. And then, of course, the third and maybe the biggest challenge, norms compliance. And it seems to us that the impact of everything we're talking about and trying to achieve really depends on the adherence to those norms and, of course, the ability to hold violators accountable. Again, I would say the absence of being able to do this today does not mean we shouldn't be pursuing the norms dialogue. But in all of this, and to get to a greater degree of norms compliance, attribution sticks out as probably the single biggest opportunity to help norms compliance. And I was really intrigued by the amount of time that I think we've seen attribution come up at this conference over the last 3 days. It's indicative of the fact that we really have moved beyond this notion that attribution is binary, it can or cannot be done, which is not the case. There's been a lot of improvement on the technological side when it comes to attribution. And that, I think, is going to put pressure on the policy side. And part of how we think about this is really that attribution breaks down into these two pieces. On the one hand, you have technical attribution and a set of stakeholders that can really help with that. There's a lot of knowledge in the private sector that if we can bring that together and somehow accumulate it and up-level it, could, I think, be a real game changer. And then on the other hand, we have or in conjunction with this, there's, of course, the political attribution piece and a set of stakeholders that need to make those determinations. And improvements on both, I think, will be ultimately what will lead to a much improved ability to get norms implemented, verified, and hold violators accountable. And so I'll leave you with just these 4 key takeaways. If you've just joined or are just waking up, try to remember these 4 things. From our perspective, we are not at the beginning of an arms race, we're in the middle of an arms race between governments and cyber, and it will likely get worse before it will get better. Second, we need a clear organizing principle, as I mentioned, to start driving some of this consensus. Third, industry, and again, I realize I'm not speaking for all of industry here, I speak for Microsoft, but in discussing with many of our industry colleagues, it's very clear that industry does want to see this debate evolve, and we think industry should contribute to its success. And finally, improving attribution, absolutely critical. How are we going to go about do this? Stay tuned. We have a new paper coming out on this June 23rd, so what I gave you was a bit of a preview. There's a lot more detail coming, but I want to thank you, and I think we have time for a few questions. Thank you.
So I see first hand already here. Kim.
Kim Zetter with Wired. I saw the Flame on your slide, and of course, Flame subverted Microsoft's software update client. So I'm wondering, and you also talked about the issue of vulnerability disclosures to vendors. So I'm wondering, like, what were the conversations that Microsoft had with the government after it was discovered that Flame was subverting Microsoft's security updates? And the government has also said, the US government has also said that it discloses 90% of the vulnerabilities that it discovers or that it purchases. Have you seen an uptick in disclosures to Microsoft? Have those conversations increased in the last few years?
So very good questions. I wasn't part of those conversations, so I can't give you a whole lot of detail around how we interacted with the US government or other governments after that attack. I can tell you in general, though, that it has been, on the one hand, I think we have put in place a world-class response process on how to deal with these issues. On the other hand, it's no secret, I think, that that response process is becoming more complicated because while in the past, finders and researchers were, I think, motivated by simply being able to do this research, get their name out there, being mentioned in our response bulletins, which then gives them a lot of credibility and ability to go work on other projects. There's a very active sort of gray market and black market out there. I think you know this probably better than most. And it is challenging, I think, for any company that's in the response business and that needs to make sure that we are securing our products to compete with some of the other players in this market. And so I think we will see this continue to evolve. This is part of the notion of the fact that we are in this arms race. And we have tried to be quite creative in terms of how we tackle this problem. For example, with things like bug bounties, where I think we've had a pioneering role in how we are going about this. And so I think it's sort of a mix of things in terms of how we do respond to these complicated and sophisticated attacks like Flame. And ultimately, I think it'll be a combination of what we're doing on the technical side, but combining that really with driving this policy dialogue and getting governments to have a much clearer stance on what the equities process is. And I think you'll see that happening when that moves beyond just one or two governments doing this, but really driving a sort of broader global consensus on this. So, see a couple more hands.
One more question over there.
Thank you very much for your very fascinating and informative talk. My name is Kubo Mačák. I teach international law at the University of Exeter. My question is actually, it relates to international law. So I would take issue with one point that you made, and that's that most of the ICT activity, because it takes place below the threshold of armed conflict, is somehow outside of the framework of international law. So to the extent that it interferes with the ability of the government to conduct its affairs, it might also amount to a violation of sovereignty. To the extent that it contains a coercive element, it might amount to a violation of the principle of non-intervention, both of which bring this activity within the realm of international law. My question would relate to the proposal that you made in 2014. It's a fascinating one, and what's really interesting about it from the international law perspective is that even though it's a non-state-driven initiative, it is state-centric in its approach. And so I wonder what reaction, if you could comment on it, did you get from the governments, from the states on your proposal? Because that's very relevant from the way that international law norms are actually generated and formed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kuba. I saw your presentation a couple of days ago, and I thought it was fascinating. But to answer your question, it's true the norms paper that we did put out was fairly state-centric, although it did actually contain a number of proposals what industry should be doing. But to sort of deepen that and to really actually come back and offer some additional thinking, we are taking that second piece really forward also in our next norms paper. But specifically to your question, I think it's fascinating. We got sort of 3 different types of reactions to the paper. Some governments indicated their displeasure. Some governments didn't really say anything and kind of, I think, acknowledged it, but didn't get a lot of feedback. And then there were some that were enthusiastically supportive. And I won't go into detail kind of who said what, but it was indicative, I think, of the fact that there is an emerging consensus by a large number of governments that this is a discussion that should not be limited to 15, 20, or 25 countries within the context of an experts group at the UN. I think that experts group is important, and they've done some tremendous work, but that certainly can't and shouldn't be the only place where these discussions take place. And so how can we inform these discussions from a private sector perspective, but not just from an industry perspective, also from, I think, an academic and an NGO and a researcher perspective. And that's not happening as much as it should to date. And so one of the things we're really pushing for is to actually drive that forward and make sure we do get to a much broader discourse on norms. So I think we're out of time, but thank you again very much.
Thank you very much, Jan.
Thank you. Thanks.